The next 3 videos, we're going to go through some don'ts, things not to do in order to maximize your scores. And the video after that, we're going to talk about a very important do that we've actually already mentioned in order to maximize your chances of a 4. So let's start with this first don't, which is do not write about whether you agree or disagree with the author, or about whether what the author is saying is true or false. This is not an argumentative essay. This is instead an analytical essay, and we'll talk about in a second what that means. But your own opinion, what you think, whether you agree or disagree, your own thesis or argument about the topic is not what we're doing here. So do not introduce any kind of personal opinion into this essay. That will be the quickest way to having problems, particularly with the analysis score. So what do we have to do instead? Well, this is from the College Board. Our goal then is to analyze and evaluate, quote, how the author uses particular techniques and elements to make his or her writing more convincing, persuasive, and powerful. Your discussion should focus on what the author does, why he or she does it, and what effect this is likely to have on our readers, on the readers. So that is the task. It's not to evaluate whether the argument is true or false, but it's to evaluate how the argument essentially works, how the author puts together their piece, and what effects the author's choices have on the readers. Again, this may seem a bit vague. Analysis trips up students a lot, not quite sure what that means. So what I want to do instead is give you an analogy that will hopefully explain what we're doing when we're analyzing something. So what I want you to do is imagine that you're a mechanic. And as a mechanic, you're trying to understand how a particular engine works. So how would you do that? Well, the first thing you would do is you would take apart the engine. You would break it down until you got down to the smallest pieces, to its basic components. Then you would answer all these types of questions. You would say, you try to answer, why are these particular parts necessary? What functions do they serve? What role do they play inside the larger whole? Which parts work together and how? So if this part and this part work together, why? How? What's the point of that? Are there any parts that are particularly well crafted or ingenious that work very well? Are there parts that make the engine work in a unique or powerful way? Is there something different about the engine from other engines out there? And what does that have to do with the parts that make up that engine, right? How does it make it unique? And then finally, we can kind of reconstruct our concept or understanding of the engine from the ground up to then ask, well, then how do these parts produce the overall effect, which in the case of an engine would be like the propelling power of it or whatever, the overall effect of that engine. So the basic idea is we take something that's complicated, we break it down into its elements, we see how those elements work and how they function and how they relate, and then we reconstruct an understanding of what the essay is doing, or excuse me, the engine is doing from those parts. So if I asked you, how does this Honda engine work? And if you responded, oh, I don't like Honda engines, I would of course say, WTF, mate, because what kind of answer is that to my question? My question is, how does this thing work? And if you respond, oh, I don't like that, that's not an answer, right? Which is why when we write our essays, you don't want to respond to the task with, oh, I think this essay is very strong, I agree with this, I agree with that. That's not the point. The point is to understand it. So for the purposes of our analogy, your like or dislike of the engine at first is irrelevant to the task of understanding it. Maybe after understanding the engine and analyzing it, we can come to a more informed opinion about what we think about it. But for the purposes of understanding it, whether or not we like it or dislike it is irrelevant. And of course, this is going to be true for the passage. So our like or dislike of the passage, or the argument the argument the author is making, is irrelevant to the task of actually understanding it. So this is exactly then what we need to do in the essay. We can just substitute in the essay for our analogy. So why are the elements and techniques used by the author, we'll call that E&T, why are those necessary? What functions do they serve? Which E&T work together and how? Are there any E&T that are particularly well crafted or ingenious? Are there E&T that make the passage work in a unique or powerful way? How do these E&T then, reconstructing the whole, produce the overall effect, which in this case, for our purposes, is persuading or influencing the reader, overall effect of the passage? And we're going to go through exactly how we do these things, but the analogy works perfectly. We break down an engine into its parts to understand the whole. We're going to break down this passage into its parts to understand the whole, or at least understand more about the whole, and that's what we're writing our essay about. One note about criticism. So it is actually possible to be critical when you're analyzing an engine or an essay, right? So far, our questions have been pretty positive, but we could also ask questions like which parts are unnecessary? Which parts don't work well together? Are there any parts that are particularly poorly crafted or ineffective? Are there parts that harm the performance of the engine? And then how do these parts detract from or harm the overall effect or purpose of the engine or the passage, right? So we could ask those questions, and those are analytical questions, but you have to be careful about this. In general, to sum up quickly, it's better to be more positive in your analysis than negative. And where does that come from? Well, the College Board says that this kind of critique is fine to a point, and this is a quote from them. They say, it's okay to fault the author in this sense, but be sure to make clear what you think the author's intent probably was. You should still devote your main effort to what the author does do and what the author intends to accomplish, even if he or she sometimes misses the mark. So they do kind of say, yeah, you can be critical, but then they say, but don't be too critical. So they're a little bit ambiguous about this. So I advise, don't be critical at all. Just focus on the strengths, how awesome and effective the essay is in terms of its elements working well. Critique in this context might get, I think, too close to opinion to be if you're not careful. So that's why I think just stay positive. It's easier. Now you might ask, well, wait a minute. If you're staying positive, isn't that kind of an opinion? And yes, I mean, this is where the boundaries blur a little bit. For our purposes, I don't want to get too complicated in this, but for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on doing a task of analysis that will try to be as neutral as possible and objective as possible. If anything, if we lean one way or the other, we're going to lean more towards talking about how well the passage is put together rather than how poorly it's put together. So again, we're going to try to limit the amount of value judgments about how good the essay is. We're going to try to limit that in our writing. But if we lean one way, we're going to lean towards how well the essay works. And don't worry, that's not opinion. The kind of opinion we want to avoid is, I agree with the author, or I disagree with the author. That's the kind of opinion we will avoid. So stay away from criticizing the essay. Just stick with, for the purposes of this task, being neutral or slightly positive.